My sister told my parents I had won the lottery, and she did it in our mother's kitchen, loud enough that the neighbors heard. She didn't ask me, she didn't call. She walked into the house while I was at the pharmacy picking up Dad's pills, found the letter I had left on the counter, and read my life aloud like she was reading a menu. That was the betrayal. She took something I'd chosen to keep private, something that felt like the last bit of agency I had, and threw it into the middle of the family like bait. She said it like a boast. She said it like a challenge. Emma's rich now, she told them. She's not one of us anymore. The way she said rich was designed to sting. She wanted everybody to know, and she wanted me to know she'd made that happen. I'd kept it secret because I thought privacy would protect not only me, but the people I still had obligations to. That simple, small choice had been erased in one breath. Our relationships were complicated, and that's putting it mildly. My parents, Helen and Robert, are both stubborn in the ways only people who have been married a long time can be. Dad is slow and forgetful these days. The doctors call it mild cognitive decline, whatever name they use. He needs pills on schedule, someone to reorder the oxygen canisters, someone to make sure he eats, and someone who can argue with insurance companies in a voice they'll take seriously. I had been that person for 6 years. I moved back into the house because the mortgage still needed paying, and Mum couldn't manage Dad's nights and the doctor bills alone. I worked part-time at the clinic so I could be there for appointments and still have something of my own income. Claire, my sister, lives 3 hours away. She visits enough to point out what she thinks we're doing wrong, but not enough to pick up the slack. She's never been generous with her money, but she is generous with opinions. She'd always assumed I'd inherit the house, or that we'd split it, or that something would happen that would make her entitled. There was an unspoken pattern. If I needed help, she would be a critic. If she wanted help, she expected I would provide it. That power imbalance is subtle until someone uses it. I couldn't simply leave the house. I couldn't walk away from my father or the mortgage in a single act of defiance without abandoning the people who needed me. And more than that, I didn't want to. So I wanted different, but not at the cost of lying or running. When I won, I thought carefully. The commission calls you and then sends certified mail. They want your name, your photo, your social security. You want a lawyer. You want distance. I set up an attorney, a trust, and a plan. The money went into a structure that would pay me a lump sum to secure the things I needed. Home for Dad, a few years of in-home care, some money for myself to breathe. I told no one. I changed nothing about the daily rhythms except for quiet things. I stopped answering questions about why I never left for the day, like my sister assumed I should. I bought groceries in bulk rather than quick stops. I paid cash for a few small essentials. I kept receipts and bank statements in a safe deposit box in town, and I left the lottery letter in my bedside drawer for 3 nights before I took it to my lawyer. Claire found the letter because she went through my mail. She told Mom she'd seen it. She told Mom she'd seen me acting strange at the grocery store, like I was trying not to run into anyone. She told Michael, our brother, who rarely takes a side but loves drama, and within 20 hours, there was a small crowd at the kitchen table, everyone talking at once about what I had with my name on it. The first wave of escalation was straightforward: requests. They weren't subtle. Claire wanted money to pay off an old debt to a man who had scammed her out of savings. Mom wanted to fix the leaking porch roof. Michael wanted cash to cover an unemployment gap while he looked for better work. Dad, when he was coherent, said, please, like it was a habit to ask me. It was all couched in love or need or urgency. They didn't phrase it as, we want your money. They phrased it as, we share everything. But they looked at me like I was a safe I'd never been before. I said no. I explained the trust, but the explanation was useless. If anything, it made them angrier. You could help us, Claire told me with that slow, righteous tone she uses when she wants to make someone feel small. You could fix things for everyone. The requests moved to pressure. She called me at work and I let it go to voicemail. The message was clipped and she sounded practiced. We're family, she said. You can't just keep this from us. Refusal brought consequence. The first consequence was subtle. My mother stopped bringing Dad his favourite porridge. She came by less. It wasn't out of spite exactly. She said she needed to think, but the effect was clear. I was the one who'd chosen secrecy. Therefore, I was the reason for the household's discomfort. It felt like punishment for exercising agency. I paid for the oxygen parts that month. I hired a home aide for the nights Dad was lonely. Money could fix the logistics, but the emotional cost, the loneliness, the suspicion accumulated. Within a week, the pressure escalated into manipulation. Claire began speaking to Dad when he was more vulnerable, in that soft voice older siblings use when they want a confession. She told him I had sold out, that I was planning to move away and leave them with the house. She said it as though she had proof. Dad, who clings to the idea that family is fair and that children behave in expected ways, nodded and looked between us like a judge who couldn't find the rule book. Then came the exclusion. They started making plans without me. There was a family meeting about the house that I was not invited to because it was a practical meeting. Claire left a flyer on the counter about a contractor she wanted to hire, one that would modernise the house. Michael began to talk about selling Dad's car to free up cash. They were not subtle about which parts of our old life they wanted to reassign or liquidate. The message was that my presence, my decisions were negotiable. I spent nights translating every conversation into its real meaning. When Mum said she was worried about being left behind, it was a way of pressuring me. So when Claire said she was worried about Dad's estate being mismanaged, it was a way of invoking the court system without having to file anything yet. The pressure turned into legal threats in whispers. A cousin with a lawyer acquaintance supposedly said that if Emma is keeping money from the family, the courts could look at that. I listened to it all but did not respond in kind. I hired my own attorney and authorised payments to secure the trust. I paid for a property inspection to show that I wasn't suddenly going to abandon Dad. Money was being used to buy me safety, and that safety was visible to the family in the worst possible way. It made them mad. Humiliation followed. Claire started telling the neighbours. She called the women who run the civic association and left a voice about someone in our neighbourhood living in secrecy while others struggle. My name started to be part of local gossip, and rooms that used to feel private began to feel like theatre stages. At the clinic, people whispered. Patients who had been friendly became awkward when I took their copay or listened to their problems. The humiliation was not dramatic. It was the low, constant kind that grinds you down. It was the look when someone pretended to be casual but really wanted to know if you were going to fund their life. The second escalation loop introduced threats to Dad's stability. Claire and Michael began to talk louder about formal guardianship. It's one of those legal phrases designed to sound helpful. File for guardianship, they said. And you protect Dad from poor choices. But the subtext was obvious. If Claire could get conservatorship or power of attorney, she could theoretically access accounts tied to Dad's name. She could cut off the aid I hired and redirect resources. She could control the narrative around me. They started collecting signatures from distant relatives who were curious or resentful about the idea of someone in the family having money. They also applied a different kind of pressure, public shame. Claire posted a thinly veiled note on social media about family solidarity and when one wins, we all do better. It was tagged with a photo of my childhood home. Comments piled up. Some were supportive, some accusatory. The worst were the ones from people who believed Claire's self-justifying story. I tried to ignore it, but it followed me to places I didn't want it. A neighbor dropped off a casserole with a note that read, "Hope, you remember your family." The note felt like a demand. I tried to keep things practical. I stopped ordering cash pickups near the house. I notified the bank of possible harassment and set up extra verification for withdrawals. I began to take Dad to the hospital with someone else present when the visits might be volatile. But for every respectful boundary I enforced, the family moved one step further. They planned a birthday for Dad at a restaurant and didn't invite me. They sent an RSVP card with a note that said, "We want this to be light for Dad." The lightness was code. It meant exclusion. For me, the emotional tilt was gradual and then sudden. There were small betrayals and then a large one. Claire, in one of the phases of the campaign, went into Dad's room and took a handful of his pill bottles to show the doctor how neglected he was. She called Adult Protective Services once, and they came to do a routine check. The social worker asked questions about medication management and who paid for care. Claire was careful and calm in front of the worker, patient and concerned. To the social worker, she seemed like the reasonable child. To me, so she was sowing discord. The campaign had a financial sting as well. Someone started sending collection notices to the house in my name. Phony bills tied to services my family claimed I had agreed to pay. A flurry of odd invoices for landscaping and roof work appeared. Claire claimed she had hired those services to preserve the property, and the bills were proof I owed them. I disputed them and found that the contractors were real, but their contracts were amorphous. They had invoices, but not signed work orders. The insinuation was enough to cause friction. I paid some bills to avoid escalation, and that small capitulation felt like a crack in my resolve. There was a moment where I lost leverage. Dad's health declined more rapidly than any of us expected. He had a stroke that left him disoriented and fragile. The hospital admitted him. The room smelled like antiseptic and lemon cleaner. I sat beside his bed and felt smaller than I ever had. In the face of his sudden vulnerability, Claire moved with the efficiency of someone who sees a window and throws open the blinds. She arrived with a stack of hospital forms and a notary on call. She was everywhere at once, in the parking lot with family members, in the hallway with the doctor, in the nurse's station asking procedural questions. When a nurse suggested that a power of attorney would be useful for decisions, Claire leaned in with that patient voice and said, "I can take that on." I didn't have the energy to fight every little thing. My emotional reserves were thin from months of strain. There's a cruelty to illness that makes negotiation feel petty beside the body in front of you. So I made a mistake. I signed a temporary authorization at the hospital that allowed family members limited access for a short period. It was meant to be bureaucratic and benign, but Claire took the form and interpreted it as permission. She used it to request copies of medical records and to speak more forcefully with certain administrators. She moved faster than I could see. The low point was sudden and quiet. I sat in a hospital chapel at 3 a.m, the lights dim, the chairs empty, and felt as though something essential had been taken from me without a fight. Dad slept with the rhythm of someone tired, and outside, the hospital hummed with indifferent machines. I had money that could have fixed the things people were arguing about, yet I felt more helpless than ever. The supposed safety the funds would bring had been turned into leverage against me. I had lost control of the narrative that had been mine by default. I was caretaker, not the one who hoarded wealth. When I left the chapel, I found a message on my phone that would change things. It was simple. A text from Claire intended for someone else. It arrived at the worst possible moment and also the best. She had meant to send it to Michael or to a friend who was helping her find an attorney, but in the slip of human error, she sent it to me. It read, "We've got her cornered. Once Dad signs, she'll have to hand over the accounts. She can't afford the fight. Make sure the forms are ready." There was no flourish, no confession of wrongdoing beyond the plain words. There was, however, evidence of intent. The text showed a plan. So the text was not a grand monologue, it was a careless note. It shifted the dynamics instantly. Up until then, we had been arguing in the vague realm of moral claims. Now there was proof that a family member was actively plotting to take advantage. I showed the message to my attorney, who did not act like justice was obvious in the way you see in television. She asked for copies, for dates, for the chain of contact. She moved methodically and coldly in a way that was comforting. She filed documents with the court to assert my fiduciary rights regarding arrangements I had already made for Dad's care. She sent a letter to Claire saying any attempt to assert control over funds that were part of the trust would be met with legal action. The world shifted from petty to formal. The wardens of institutions, banks, courts, hospital administrators responded to paperwork. The consequences were predictable and also surprising. The court required a hearing to assess the claims. Claire's friends and allies who had been ready to support her wavered when they saw the text and realized it could be used in court. People who had assumed the worst about me suddenly had to reconcile their assumptions with a concrete admission of intent. In legal terms, we converted gossip into evidence. My leverage increased because I had the money to hire professionals who knew the language of institutions. That, of course, is the cruel irony. Money bought me the capacity to stop people from taking my money. The hearings were quiet in the way courts are. Slow, bureaucratic, both purposeful and petty. There were sworn statements, medical records, and long silences. Claire's defense was a set of plausible things: concern, urgency, love. Her argument was that she had been trying to protect Dad. The judge did not look like the kind of person who wanted to mete out family punishment. He wanted facts. The text was a fact. We reached a kind of practical settlement. It wasn't dramatic. The court appointed an independent conservator for Dad's financial affairs for the duration of his hospitalization and recovery. Someone from a non-profit organization meant to be neutral. The conservator reviewed accounts and put temporary safeguards in place. The trust I had set up remained intact. The trustee was a professional firm that had the documents in order. They had the authority to manage disbursements for Dad's care and for the household needs. Claire did not get the sweeping power she had wanted. She got limited access for a few weeks to arrange certain things under supervision. There were costs. Claire stopped speaking to me, and not in an emotional way, but in a logistical, deliberate way. She stopped leaving notes. She stopped calling Dad. She joined group texts where people discussed house plans in abstract terms without inviting me. She sent one email, cold and measured, requesting a cash contribution for utility bills, which she framed as fair. When I refused, she escalated to a civil suit for contributions to household needs, which was more theatre than law. It cost me money and time to defend it, and it meant more hearings and more paperwork and a lot of people asking questions about things that had only been mine to know. The situation settled into something quieter and no less costly. I had what I needed materially. Dad's care covered, the mortgage paid, the home inspected and made safe, but I had lost the simple thing I had hoped money would let me keep: normalcy. Normalcy is underrated. It's the ability to go to a store without being part of a conversation. It was small acts. Walking my dog in the evening without neighbors staring, taking Dad to the park without a running commentary about my bank account, buying a plane ticket without gossip. Money had bought protection, but not the easy invisibility I craved. There were pragmatic consequences to the legal shift as well. The conservator paid for a full in-home plan for Dad, which included a daytime aide and a night nurse on rotating shifts. He recommended, and I agreed, that Dad be transferred to a short-term rehab where his mobility could be assessed. Those concrete actions changed the tenor of our lives. He got better, then stable. The house lost some of the half-hidden resentment in the corners simply because problems were solved. But the family's emotional fractures remained. The emotional payoff was quieter than I imagined. Claire did not end up destitute or humiliated in a way that was satisfying. She lost influence and respect in the ways that matter in the family. She lost the trust of some relatives who saw her tactics, and she lost the easy moral posture she used to take. Mum, who had been torn, made peace with me in small increments. She called more often, but there were still afternoons she didn't visit. Michael drifted between us, sometimes reaching out to ask about Dad, sometimes not. Dad's recovery made the edges less sharp. He was more himself, which soothed something in my chest. The litigation drained resources, but not the entirety of what I had set aside. I learned some practical things the hard way. One is that secrecy is not a guaranteed defense. It is a deliberate risk management choice. The other is that institutions respond to paper quickly and people respond to perceived property slowly. When greed is engaged in a family, it moves like a rash. It spreads if you scratch it, and it leaves a mark if you do nothing. The attorney fees were a price I paid to stop the worst of it, but what cost me more was the erosion of trust. Some people know now what I could have done. Some people don't know. Some will never forgive me for not distributing the money in the way they think fair. I am not the keeper of fairness. I am only a person who made choices and tried to protect what needed protecting. There were moments of quiet satisfaction, not the cinematic revenge I once imagined, but small domestic victories. I replaced the kitchen faucet Claire had insisted on redoing without my input because the old one was fine. I hired a cook to come twice a week so Mom wouldn't have to lift pots. I arranged for Dad to see a physical therapist who gave him hope after the stroke. I planted a maple tree in the backyard because Dad always liked the shade it would someday give. Those things felt like using money to restore private life rather than to fight public battles. The long-term consequence is that some relationships have ended and some have been repaired. Claire and I speak only in necessary logistics, and if she calls unexpectedly, I do not answer. Mom visits more often and brings pie. She sometimes sits with me on the couch and watches static on television when there is nothing else to do. Michael calls to ask about Dad's appointments and sometimes drops off groceries. He's not a hero. He's a man who wants things to be less complicated. Dad is quieter and, to my great relief, he remembers my name most days. That memory, small and stubborn, is a kind of grace. If there is a lesson here, it is not a tidy one. I don't believe in moralizing the story. I don't think you win by spite or by paying people off so they'll like you. I also know that money creates options and that options change the way people treat you. The most practical choice I made was to put the funds somewhere they would be managed professionally and to document everything. The most important decision, and the one that hurt the most, was to put my father first, even when it made me vulnerable. That vulnerability was exploited and that stung. But when everything was said and done, Dad's safety mattered more than the approval of people who saw my choices as a threat to their claim on me. I still think about that night in the hospital chapel, the hollow ache of being alone with worry. I think about how the text arrived like an accidental key to a locked door, and with that small slip, the rooms of my life changed. I think about how power looks in families, not like a dramatic takeover, but like 1,000 small movements that add up. I think about how money can be armor and also a target. I am not free of the cost. There are relatives who will not be at my table. There are neighbors who will eye my car a little longer when it pulls into the driveway. There are afternoons I spend cataloging invoices and answering emails from lawyers rather than walking in the park. But the house is stable. Dad's meds arrive on time. There is a woman who comes 3 days a week to make sure he eats. And when I look at his sleeping face, I know I chose well for his life. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you for listening. If this story resonated or unsettled you, please leave a like. It helps me know these confessions reach people who care. If you want to hear more real stories, consider subscribing. And if you've ever had to make a choice where money and family collide, I'd like to hear what you did. Leave a comment if you feel like sharing.